Hello and welcome, everybody. Today I'm joined by Professor Haggai Erlich. Professor Erlich is Emeritus Professor actually at Tel Aviv University, and he's someone who has written dozens of articles and books on the Horn of Africa, and especially on Tigray and Ethiopia in general. And his latest book is titled Greater Tigray and the Mysterious Magnetism of Ethiopia. And he has joined me today to talk about some of the points that he has raised in his book, the points that I think are relevant to the political discourse in Tigray. And thank you, Professor Erlich, for joining me today.
My pleasure, Tigray. Oh, good to be here.
Thank you very much indeed. I think I'm going to start by asking you to tell us how you got yourself into studying the history of Tigray. You say in the book that you started your journey with your PhD dissertation on Alula. And I'm curious to know how you got into that in the 1970s, I believe, or 1960s it would have been.
Initially, I was a historian of the Middle East. My BA from Tel Aviv University and MA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem were on Egypt, Yemen, and so on. And then Tel Aviv University, they summoned me, the rector and other important people, and said that we are going to open an African department, African history department, East African department, and they will finance my PhD in London. I'm talking 1969. If I switch to Africa, on which I knew very, very little. But the great mentor of mine, the late Professor Tzvi Yavetz, had served in Addis Ababa. In fact, he was the first Dean of Humanities in Haile Selassie, the first university. So he took me aside and said, well, you will be fascinated by Ethiopia. It's not only African, it's also Oriental. I'm quoting him. And it's a fascinating history and country and people. So I was married at the time with one son. And in fact, it was the money that drew me to this wonderful field of Ethiopian history. But upon arriving in London, and the late Professor Gideon Goldenberg taught me some Amharic in Tel Aviv. But when I came to the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, they asked me, what do you want to do? I said, I'm an Arabist by background, and from what I learned, I want to do a PhD on Emperor Johannes, because he fought with the Egyptians and the Sudanese. But then Professor Edward Ullendorf, who was later sort of my mentor, said, no, the Judge Matsaude Gabriel Selassie is in Oxford, and he's completing his PhD on Johannes, who had been his grandfather. No competition I could offer. And then he said, why don't you write on Ras Alula? And I said, it's a brilliant idea. And I ran home to find who was this Ras Alula. And that was the beginning of my introduction to Ethiopian history through this amazing fellow, Ras Alula. And after that, I went on studying and writing and researching Ethiopian history. I never, by the way, left aside my Middle Eastern interest. And also, as you know, I wrote about Ethiopia and the Middle East, Ethiopia and Egypt, and so on. But I later on found this term, the magnetism of Ethiopia, the mysterious magnetism. But I was magnetized from the very beginning. And this is now, what, 55 years later. It was a very difficult decision on my part. I really knew nothing, except for Abeba Bikila winning the marathon in Rome. That was the only thing I knew about Ethiopia at the time. But then as the more I delved into the history, the more I was captivated by this magnet of Ethiopia, which holds together the country, but also it's still holding all those interested academically with Ethiopia. The community of Ethiopians, they are all fascinated. There is something romantic about this unique country. But the concept of the magnetism which holds together, I came across years later when I studied the period of the early 1940s. After the British liberated Ethiopia from Mussolini, there was an argument between them, between the military officers, the British. One group maintained that Ethiopia is dismembering, it's something very anachronistic, and therefore we have to divide it between us. Annex Tigray to Eritrea, which Mussolini had done, and the rest of it, maybe you can let Haile Selassie toy with it, but it's a lost case in any case. But there was another group who knew Ethiopia better than the political officers. The intelligence officer, very intelligent person, Chisman, Major Chisman. He wrote that those who don't know really Ethiopia are not familiar with a mysterious magnetism, which holds the crazy structure of the Ethiopian Empire. And after that, I tried to explain to myself and others, what is this magnetism which holds Ethiopia's country? I have only partial answers. The question is more clever than the answers. But first of all, it was a fact that Ethiopia existed for 2,000 years. And there was something, as he put it, which held together the crazy structure of the Ethiopian Empire. One question deriving from that is, what was this magnetism in the past? And the other is still magnetism there? So partial answers would be that Ethiopia is a unique civilization, that it had its own culture, generally all Ethiopian culture, institutes, the church, the crown, whatever administration, and the old magnetism really kept together. And by the way, in the discussion between those two British camps, he proved right, Chisman. And the right moment was the decision of Ras Alula of Tigray to submit to Haile Selassie. The other British wanted him to be under their auspices and related to the British in Asmara, in Eritrea. But then in our very time, major elements of this magnetism were eroded, if not disappeared, if not destroyed. The religious aspect was destroyed during the time of Mengistu and the royal emperorship, and the regional hierarchies connected to the center somehow. They are all destroyed. And the question is still now even more valid. Is there any magnet that will keep Ethiopia together? And I'm sure we can go on into that later in this talk.
Indeed, that's going to be the main thrust of our conversation, not least because the debate that the British officials were having then, whether Ethiopia should or would disintegrate, or whether there was some magnet that was holding it together. That is the kind of debate that people in Ethiopia today are having, because on the face of it, it's a country that should disintegrate. That is the impression that you get, not only because you don't know about Ethiopia, even for those of us who were raised in Ethiopia, who understand Ethiopia, you get the impression that there isn't something that is holding it together, but it goes on, like you said. So we're going to come back to that conversation. But for now, I'm interested to know about the logistical aspects of your PhD. You said that it was in the 1969, and I would want to know what it was like then. Was it? Did you have to travel to Tigray? Was it how you did your PhD? What was your how was Ethiopia perceived in Israel and in London, where you did your PhD? Then, please tell us a little bit about that.
In Israel of the time, we are talking the late years of Haile Selassie, Ethiopia was a very important ally. In fact, the atmosphere in Israel was that the revolutionary Arab world, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, is uniting, determined to destroy Israel, and therefore the Israeli strategy, as conceived by David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, was that Israel should reach out to the alliance with the periphery of the Middle East, which is not Arab. It meant Turkey. It was not a success story. It was Iran, which was an overly successful because the Iranian, until today, they remember that Israel was supporting the Shah, and Ethiopia. And with Ethiopia at the time, I came first to Ethiopia in May 1970. And then for my PhD as a London University student, it was from September 71 to April 72. I spent 6 months, half a year. At that time, there were hundreds of Israeli families scattered all around the country, advising and helping in everything. At that time, Israel invested in Ethiopia the best it could, in more substantial quantities and qualities than in every other place in the world. For the Israelis, it was Ethiopia, the source of the Nile that gives life to Egypt, the source of the Red Sea and the rest of Africa, and also this element of historical brotherhood and all the myth of King Solomon and Queen of Sheba. And Ethiopia was very, very, I was accepted at the time like I came from Jerusalem, not from Tel Aviv or London. Now, by the time I came to Ethiopia in September 71, I have studied everything I could read on Ras Alula in the period. By the way, there was next to nothing written on Alula. I found here and there 5 lines, 6 lines, to put it in brackets, Haile Selassie's regime, and prior to that, Menelik's regime, tried to marginalize the role of Tigray in general and Ras Alula in particular. So I had to rediscover the materials. In London, of course, the British were involved in all the stories around in the British archives. Then in Italy, spent a few months in Italian archives. For them, Alula was the great nemesis. And I found Sudanese material, Egyptian material, and then in Ethiopia itself, in French, in Ethiopia itself, first in the Addis Ababa, Haile Selassie University, the Institute of Ethiopian Studies. And then I went to Tigray proper. And they recorded what there were enough old people who still remembered Alula when I came, or at least they heard firsthand what their parents told them. So I made an extensive oral research. And then in March 1972, that was the finest hour of my being an historian. I went with the two granddaughters of Alula to Manawe near Abiadi. Well, it's 5 hours drive by a jeep, not that near. And there, much to my surprise, the people of this little village, I don't think there were more than 60, 70 of them, they show me documents, the biography of Ras Alula written by his priest. Somehow I convinced them to lend me this treasure. And I went to Makale and photocopied it. There was a very, very noble soul, a missionary and a linguist, Roger Cowley, who began translating for me. And I returned the manuscript back to Manawe, a copy I sent to the Institute of Ethiopian Studies. But this was the spirit of the time and the people, written by a priest in Gez. And there was the very soul of Ethiopia, Christian Ethiopia at the time, facing under Johannes, the Shoans and the Gojamites and the others, and the challenge of Egyptian, Sudanese, and Italian imperialism. And I could record, after 2 years of collecting this material, the story of Ras Alula, the son of a peasant who became, in fact, the right-hand man of Emperor Johannes, and the one who defeated the Egyptians, defeated the Mahdists, the Sudanese, and defeated the Italians in the Battle of Dogali, 1887. And then later took part in the Battle of Adwa, already under Menelik. So for me, entering history of Ethiopia in the glorious moment of surviving and entering the 20th century as a victorious, independent country. This coupled with the fact that nearly all the battles were fought in Tigray, and the Tigrayans paid with their blood for the general victory, and then were reduced to a marginal, impoverished, destroyed part of the land. So that was the element which introduced me to seeing the role of Tigray in the history of Ethiopia, the moment of glory and the beginning of historical decline that I could witness in 1970 as I went there, and later on many times as an historian of Ethiopia as a whole. And then, of course, the revival of Tigray is a central power in the whole of Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi. And again, the finest hour of Tigray from 1991, liberating Ethiopia from Mengistu, until 2018, when they were marginalized again, and the conflict which stemmed from those changes. And I also tried all throughout not to be the advocate of any side. My profession, the way I see it, is to apply integrity and see the complex picture, try to understand it, and then write and teach about it. I can see the differences, I can see the sensitivities, but I am not the lawyer of either side. I take pride in that. That's my profession. Number one tool for a true historian is integrity. Because if you don't have integrity and you take a side, you can do everything you want. Someone wiser than me wrote once, we don't have history. We have historians. What they think and what they write, this is history. The real history disappeared, faded away. You, the historian, you have to decide what is history and what is not, and what you write and what is on the shelf. This is history. What really happened, gone, disappeared. So it's a very, very, very responsible task to be impartial, to exercise integrity, and try to understand the chain of events and present it as objectively as you can, knowing your limitations, that after all, you are a human being, having your own concepts, and history itself is made by human beings. I tried never to give allowance to any side and just present my understanding of what were the sequence of events called history.
Well, that's an interesting point, Professor, because in the book you say that any historian worth their salt, although they are writing about the past, they are informed by current problems and by current events. They are informed and dictated by current problems. What problem were you trying to address when you set out to write the book? And to give a bit of context to our listeners, you started, well, you finished actually almost writing the book it would have been 2019, 2020, before the war started, because towards the end, You say that as you were putting the finishing touches on the book, the war broke out, the war in Tigray. So this is a book that you had started before the war. But what was the problem that you were dictated by in the light of your philosophical view that a historian should be dictated by current problems?
Was an Italian philosopher, Benedetto Croce, who said, every history is contemporary history. You observe it from up the hill on which you are standing. But one has to know that this can be misleading. We write history from today to tomorrow, but it is unfolding from yesterday to today. And you have to be aware of it. When I finished the first draft, by the way, it's sort of a synthesis of everything I wrote on Alula and on Haile Selassie, on the British and the Italians during the time of Mussolini, and the war in Eritrea, and so on, trying to synthesize it all. And when I started doing it in 2017 or 18, I don't recall, it seemed that it's a very sad story buried in the past of Tigray's demise. But then suddenly the war started, into which I did not delve, and the whole story seemed to be illuminated from a different angle. Suddenly the Tigrayans are not that poor. It's not a country that was good for raising rocks, but a new generation that, for me, like out of the blue, managed to build a force that could wipe out Mengistu and take control of Ethiopia and try to build a new system in the country as a whole. So, in a way, consciously or unconsciously, I readdress the past in this light. That after all, Tigray was not that destroyed, ruined, poor, marginalized. It is proven to be strong enough to reappear on the central stage of the regional and Ethiopian history.
Yeah, and again, to add a bit of context, when you say Tigray in the book, you mean current Tigray and the highlands of current Eritrea. That's your conception of Greater Tigray. So I thought I would add that bit of information for people to get a fuller picture of what you mean when you say Tigray. So to take it back to Alula, Professor, you say that when you went to Tigray in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, you met people who had firsthand, who heard from firsthand accounts about Alula. What were the things that people believed about Alula then, and what are the actual truth, so to speak, about Alula that you established through your research through the decades?
At the time when I came there, Tigray was really humiliated, and Rasium, the grandson of Johannes, got married to the family of Haile Selassie, And in Tigray itself, I came first to Makalle. It was a very poor country, land at the time. Everyone who was someone had emigrated to Addis Ababa or went abroad. Young generation, well, I saw young people in Makalle, in Adwa, Aviaddi. But they all idolize the myth of Ras Alula. For example, when I came to Manawe, to this village, and I was amazed to understand that they are going to lend this manuscript to me. I realized, I told them that I'm coming from Jerusalem and I will redeem the name of Alula. So they were so enthusiastic. There were children running to various tukuls and bringing more pages. So Alula at the time was kind of a myth. In his time, he was quite known. The British called him the greatest general of Africa. For the Italians, he was the great monster who defeated and humiliated them. But that was 80, 90 years before that. When I came to Tigray 71, 72, I had to tell people what are the facts behind the myth that they knew as such, as a myth. So reconstructing his story was quite an adventure, because after all, he was the son of a peasant. That made his way to the top through the aristocracy, being a servant first, and then a tax collector, and then under Johannes, he was given a command over one battalion, and he excelled in all that and went up the ladder to become, in fact, number 2 under Johannes. But there was a very strong social story behind it, because the aristocracy of Tigray, still, those are families that were built on 16th century opportunities to get more arms than the other families in regions of Ethiopia, and they were between them, despising this upstart. But he managed to be a brilliant general, and then the man whom Johannes charged with turning Eritrea into the base of Ethiopia. In fact, he took the little village of Asmara and turned it into his headquarters. And he was in a way, the king of Marabelash, of Eritrea under Johannes. He was fully loyal to Johannes. So there was a very interesting and glorious aspect to the story of Alula. But I have to admit that along the way, I found that he was flesh and blood, that he knew how to hate, how to punish, how to betray, how to be nasty to others. In a certain moment, in 1892, that's a secret between the new, he collaborated with the Italians against Menelik, because he wanted Tigray to remain independent from the Shoan. So he was flesh and blood. and he even ended in a stupid side conflict with another Rasagos, if I remember, and died on the margins. So the personal story, a great talent. By the way, until today, I'm not sure he could read and write. But he made history in helping Johannes to become the emperor of Ethiopia. And then when Johannes was killed in the Battle of Matama, in his attempt to keep Tigray impoverished, destroyed Tigray, stuck between the Italians in Asmara in Eritrea and the Shoans, now the rich Menelik in the south, to keep Tigray going. And that was not a very clever strategy. At the end, June the 2nd, 1894, he and Ras Mangasha and Ras Waldo and another Ras, I don't remember, they had to go to Addis Ababa and submit to Menelik. And after that, he disappeared from Tigray, even though later on he went back to the north to help Menelik in the Battle of Adwa. By the way, today is March the 1st, Adwa Day. So he had his role in contributing to the great victory of Ethiopia, historical victory. But the victory itself was Menelik's. The fact that Ethiopia could master something in the neighborhood of 200,000 riflemen and defeat the Italians and enter the 20th century as an independent state, it had to do with military bravery, but also to the fact that under Menelik, Ethiopia was now quite an empire. It could mobilize all the logistics. The Italians had to commit mistakes in the day of Adwa because they were detached from supplies. But army under Menelik and Taitu and others, and of course, Ras Makonnen, the father of Haile Selassie, who was in charge of logistics, was the army of a well-organized state. Unlike the armies of Johannes and Tigray, betrayed by Menelik, who had, first of all, they didn't, the number was like 80,000, 100,000 soldiers, but they didn't have the logistics. One important historical fact is that the Italians didn't capture Asmara. Alula had to abandon Asmara to help Johannes in the center against the Italians, then against the Sudanese, the Mahdiya. And the soldiers of Tigray were fed by the country. They simply ate whatever was available for them at the expense of the peasants. They destroyed facing the Italian army of San Marzano, March. I don't remember exactly the month, but I'll be excused. They were facing the Italians. The Italians were well supplied, modern army, entrenched, and so on. And the Tigrayans who outnumbered them, but couldn't assault their fortifications and had to feed on the country. This and that Ras went to Tembien, this and that Ras to Darta, and so on and so on, and they were eating the country until they had no choice but to go either against Menelik or against the Sudanese, who meanwhile burned Gondar. And there Johannes found his death. But there was a big difference between what Tigray had and what Menelik managed to build.
Well, I think one, as I read through the pages on Alula in your book, one thing that I was really struck by was the degree, the absolute, I would say, loyalty of Alula to Johannes. This is a man who had a lot of opportunity to even topple Johannes, because he commanded, like I said, a lot of riflemen. He had a lot of opportunities to collaborate with the Italians or with the Sudanese to topple Johannes, and toppling power struggle with the norm of the day. But he was absolutely devoted to Johannes, and I wonder why. Where did that level of loyalty and commitment to your superior came for Alula, for someone who, like you said, rose from the humblest of backgrounds? Becoming the emperor of Ethiopia would have been such a momentous achievement for him, and he could have done that if he wanted to, but he didn't. And I'm fascinated to know why. Where did his level of loyalty come from?
First of all, the simply human aspect. Johannes was, I think, 20 years older than him. Johannes made him. And Johannes was a great figure. What Johannes did was to unite, first of all, to unite Tigray. You had the family, Ras Mikhael Sahul, and the gentleman Sabagadis, and so on, and data from Hamasen, from this and that. Johannes managed to unite Tigray, and they were all loyal to him because he built the big empire controlling greater Ethiopia. That's not new in history, someone who managed to really build. If you take later on Menelik. Menelik was the architect of Ethiopia in today's boundaries. And as long as he lived, everyone was loyal to him. There was a special bond between Alula and Johannes. By the way, Johannes was a very moody person. He married his first wife, who died later on and never married again. And Alula used to come to comfort him. There was something between them. And he loved Alula. Also was angry with him for disobeying his orders and slaughtered the Italians in the Battle of Dogali in January 1887, causing the Italians to come and. But in between them, on a personal level, after Johannes died, the story was that on his deathbed at the Battle of Batemma, Johannes said that his son Mangasha would inherit him. And Alula remained loyal to Mangasha. Mangasha was nothing comparing to Alula in terms of leadership, but he remained loyal to Mangasha to the end. So there was a human touch to the question, but also the political. Johannes built the power of Tigray. He managed to withstand to Emperor Theodorus. He collaborated with the British, who came to destroy Theodorus, the Battle of Magdala. They called him the Prince of Tigray and gave him the arms before they left. So Johannes was quite a personality, unifying the church and so on. We have to see it also in the religious terms of the period. Alula was a Christian to the bone, and Johannes was a priest. So there was this element of human touch, of religious culture, and in the power game. Also, the power base of Alula was in Asmara. In Tigray proper, all the members of the aristocracy hated him. He could not, really. He placed Johannes, surely not betray him, in Tigray itself.
Well, he came from the, yeah. I mean, he came from the peasants, so they had reason to despise him, I presume.
I call him Harastai, a peasant.
Yeah. Yes.
There is one point which, as you go through today's development and seeing the past again, the great rival of Tigray in Hamasen, in Eritrea, in Asmara, was the local Ras Alula, who was in fact the greatest personality of the Marab Melash, of what would be Eritrea, the Tigrayans. And when Alula built his power in Asmara, he sort of tricked him and betrayed him, if you will, and sent him in chains to Johannes, where he spent 20 years or something on Ambasalaba. Today, the Eritreans re-enlivened the story that Alula was the traitor, was a Tigrayan colonialist. He betrayed Ras Alula. There came a book in Asmara on that. So this formative period of Alula, really a formative period, Ethiopia assuring its independence, then losing Asmara to the Italians, and all that is addressed time and again by today's people. There you have the big question, the great people, Tigrinya speakers. At the time, they controlled Eritrea until today and controlled Ethiopia under Meles. And instead of uniting, they fought each other bitterly.
Well, I think it's a good point you raise in terms of how Alula is portrayed in Eritrea today. And I think the negative caricatured image of Alula in Eritrea is a part of the project that the Eritrean regime has been embarking on for the past 30 years to create an Eritrean identity distinct from Tigray identity. And one way of achieving that is by saying that historical figures that are revered in Tigray are actually traitors and other negative epithets, like you said in terms of Alula. But I mean, as a historian, what do you say is the legacy of Alula in Eritrea? How should Eritreans view and understand Alula actually?
They understand it by their own terms, as you just said, that they already developed a modern Eritrean identity, and the Tigrayan fellows are Ethiopians, and Alula was an Ethiopian colonialist who subjugated them. The story, of course, of Ras Alula is a reflection of that. In 1995, I came again to Ethiopia. I came to Ethiopia every 2 years or so, and gave a talk on Alula, and it was maybe I mixed the dates. The centenary of Dogali, the battle that Alula ambushed the Italians and massacred them, 25th January 1887. So I was talking about it in Addis, and then I went to Asmara and gave it the same talk to the leadership of the EPLF. I was told that Isaias is listening from the other room. And I was talking about Alula the way I did briefly with you now. And then they started. He was not a hero, he was a colonialist, he was an imperialist, he tried to destroy us, and so on and so on. Then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I don't remember his name now, said, "You remember the monument that Mengistu built to Alula in Dogali? There was a big monument of statue of Alula, the victorious Alula against the Italians. So you remember he told me. I said, of course I remember. I was there attending the inauguration of it. He said, well, I myself blasted it with a bazooka. They destroyed. Alula for them is the great nemesis. So they keep mentioning Alula was not only an angel. In 1886, he was charged by Johannes to capture the Sudanese town of Kassala and failed. And frustrated, coming back to Asmara, he massacred the Kunama and the Baria tribesmen. They failed to supply and so on, committed a very nice massacre, and the Eritreans until today remember it. It's part of the Eritrean myth that those Ethiopian Tigrayans, they massacred people. So it's part of the Eritrean ethos. And this is one of the failures of the Tigrayan people in Ethiopian history as a whole, failing to really unite. They united under Johannes, and they united again with the TPLF, EPRDF. And once they united, they were able to control good part of Ethiopia and lead a big chapter in its history. So what Meles did, I don't go into the internal struggles within the TPLF. The TPLF, what he did is to lead the revolution in Tigray itself first. There were 3 revolutions in that period. The Derg, the establishment of the Derg and the capturing power in Addis Ababa, then the creation, the victory of the EPLF over the ELF in Eritrea, and the rise of the TPLF out of the poor Tigray to build a force which defeated Mengistu and led Ethiopia for from 1991 to 2018, and trying to apply the Tigrayan thesis again.
Well,
why I came to this, I'm following the question you want to raise. The Tigrayan thesis, by the way, that's my invention, the term. Ioannis didn't want to centralize Ethiopia. Theodorus, who preceded him, tried and failed miserably. And Ioannis understood the lesson, and it also connected to an old Tigrayan concept that we Tigrayans, we are the creme de la creme. And Ioannis led Ethiopia as a federation. He recognized Menelik as the king of Shoa. He recognized Tekla Haymanot as the king of Gojam. He may do with unifying the church. But in terms of political aspects, he was happy with the federal structure. By the way, he also conducted Ethiopia in Amharic, not in Tigrinya. And when Meles and the TPLF, EPRDF, they built Ethiopia on ethnic terms, it was historically following the same philosophy. It also stemmed from the reality because the new Ethiopia was the continuation of the various liberation fronts who fought Mengistu. They emerged spontaneously on the basis of ethnicity. It's not that Meles and the TPLF came with a chart and decided. They inherited a situation in which the Oromo Liberation Front and the Afar Liberation Front and the Sidama Liberation Front and so on were there. This was the spontaneous product of the society of Ethiopia along the ethnic lines. But in a way, it was returning to the prescription of Ioannis and what I call the Tigrayan thesis of Ethiopia is the home of various ethnic groups. Still, there is a big magnet that holds it together, but it's a land of diversity, of ethnic cultures, of ethnic hierarchies, and so on. And Ethiopia should build itself. All those who tried, not all, but many of those who tried to centralize Ethiopia, impose one culture, one administration, and so on, ended like Mengistu or Theodorus. It's very, very difficult to impose one system on such a diversified country with different cultures. Each is entrenched for many years. So between, rightly or wrongly, I call it the Amhara thesis of one country, like the Amharic language, which assimilates all the other cultures, and the Tigrayan thesis, the exercise in ethnic federalism. In between them, I can see the whole history of Ethiopia along the centuries. This tension between Ethiopia, the land of many cultures and ethnic groups and so on, and the idea, imperial, communist, whatever you, Ethiopia is a one centralized system. In between them, it is still the game of today.
Well, it's interesting about the Tigrayan thesis and the Amhara thesis, and if we have time, we're going to come back to that in a fair bit of detail. You say in the book that the TPLF founders, Meles and people around him, were inspired by Alula, and that Meles, maybe he wasn't trying to be the second incarnation of Alula, but he was trying to follow in the footsteps of Alula. That's what one of the points that you raise in the book, by way of creating a federal structure, a decentralized structure. But people, I think, especially today, in the light of what has happened to Tigray, a lot of people in Tigray would say that actually Meles might have created a nominally decentralized and federal structure, but otherwise, essentially, it was a centralized system, because the TPLF didn't mind Amharic being the national language, although technically they called it the working language. The TPLF didn't mind Addis Ababa being the center of economic power and political power and cultural center and everything. And in all meaningful aspects, during the time of the TPLF, Tigray was really marginalized. And that the idea that the Meleses and people around him were trying to create a centralized system is unfair. People would say that. Is it a view with which you might have some sympathy?
I knew Meles quite well. Every time I came to Ethiopia, I was summoned to his chambers, and we spent hours talking. In one of our conversations, he said, "Well, Haggai, don't forget my arrogance." He was a very strong-minded person, happy to demonstrate his intellectual ability, not only towards other Ethiopians, but also the community of Ethiopians all over. And he was really a very brilliant person. And he saw his task to move Ethiopia forward, the whole of Ethiopia. Not just to redeem Tigray and move everything to Tigray. And he was very much successful at a certain stage, until he died of brain cancer in 2012. I came and went every other year. It's unbelievable, the pace of progress. Also by my economist colleagues, it was a marvel. President Clinton called him a model for the whole of Africa. And you could see in your eyes the development. 10% growth a year. And this was done not only by goodwill and prayers, but also by Meles being a very determined person. one point of failure of his was mental inability, may I judge, to make peace with the Amhara. I remember one meeting that I told him, you must allow a state funeral for Haile Selassie. Forgive me for saying he was the greatest Ethiopian in the 20th century, whatever we can say about him. And Mele said, no. He was angry at me for making the point. No. He made us dying of starvation. There was something inflexible about him. And the failure of the TPLF to make peace with the the Amhara can be also attributed to him. On the other hand, I wrote about it a different book. The construction of the Renaissance Dam, it took a meles to do so. The waters of the Blue Nile were defined by the World Bank back in 2000 as the #1 resource of Ethiopia. But when you look back, no one did anything about it. The great Haile Selassie, great Menelik, the great Mengistu, everyone approached it from, in fact, they did nothing. Mengistu only threatened that the Soviets would come and do it to punish the Egyptians. Haile Selassie built a bridge. Menelik built a bridge for pedestrians over the gorge of the Blue Nile. But to build the dam, it took some meles to do it. And if you ask me, if you go back to the essence of our conversation, is there any magnetism that can hold Ethiopia together? It's the Renaissance Dam. If it would become the hub of a new Ethiopia, if the potentiality of economic growth by exploiting this resource, electricity for industrializing Ethiopia and so on, it's a great revolution, which I doubt if it will materialize. But it was the doing of meles. It's there because of meles.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, if you'll have to go for a moment, it's fine. We can wait. So, yeah, it's all right.
My wife has to go down.
Oh, all right. Okay, I see.
If you hear in
All
the
right.
background, there is a demonstration against Bibi.
Yeah, a lot of political development in Israel. I'm aware of that. So I think one point in terms of the essence of the Grand Renaissance Dam and how that might prove to be the magnet that will hold Ethiopia together. I think you are putting emphasis on economic development and economic integration, and I think that is something that people like Meles believed as well. If the different regions were integrated economically, then the ethnic friction and all the other problems that always sort of pose a threat to Ethiopia would be would be suppressed. I think that was the thinking. And some people might say that that sort of analysis underestimates the power of hatred that exists, for instance, against Tigrayans in Ethiopia. It's something that some people compare to the power, to the very, very vicious power of anti-Semitism, for instance. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you behave as a Jew, or what your situation is. For instance, there is always, in some corners at least, ingrained in people's DNA, sort of a feeling of hatred, and that sort of hatred exists in Ethiopia, and that wouldn't change even if Ethiopia was to change economically. And I think that is one point that people raise when you tell them, actually, the answer to Ethiopia's problems is economic development. They will tell you, and this is something that a lot of people accuse Meles of failing to understand, that they didn't take steps to protect the Tigrayans, to develop the Tigrayans so that they are in a position to protect themselves against the vicious hatred that is otherwise directed their way. So how do you, as a historian, as someone who studies patterns, who understands the power of negative stereotypes against people, how do you say would again, if we were to assume that the Renaissance Dam will be completed and Ethiopia would move many steps economically, how do you say would that be a solution to the insidious problem that I'm describing?
I'm not looking for solutions. The essence of humanity is, as you said, is based on hatred and envy and stupidity and ingratitude and whatever. Economy is always important. Meles, by the way, as a young man, he started as a Marxist. But surely it is Ethiopia existed always on offering something to the peripheral aristocracy. But I don't think that, let me tell you this way. I wrote I told you, I don't remember, a sort of an autobiography of me as an historian of Ethiopia. First, I came to Ethiopia in the later years of Haile Selassie. It was a period of expectations, of hope. The people I met at the university and so on, they said, after the Negus will go, we shall build a great republic, maybe constitutional monarchy, but Ethiopia has a great future ahead of it. And I was full of expectations and very optimistic. Then came Mengistu. And my experience was of a great disappointment. And then came Meles and the regime, and I could see there is hope to the country. And now I'm disappointed again. By the way, the same is go with my career as an historian of Arab societies around. When I was a kid, a youngster, there was a period of Nasserism. Unity, revolution, socialism, great hope. Then came a period of dictatorship, then of political Islam, then the Arab Spring, and today you look around, what remained of the great expectations of the Nasserite period? Quite the contrary. So, by nature, I am a very optimistic person, but try to be realistic also. I don't believe in a great leader who changed the world. I believe in making do with what you can. There was a great leader of Israel, Levi Eshkol, who inherited Ben Gurion. And he said, the prime minister said, I come to the government meetings and I compromise and compromise and compromise until I win the discussion.
That's a good line.
I don't, it's not my profession to give advice. And to tell you frankly, I'm quite disappointed at Ethiopia. Also at Israel, and surely of our Arab neighbors. But this is it.
Well, if we could, yeah, because I mean, there's a lot of reason to be disappointed about Ethiopia. So, as an historian who understands the source of the problems that are afflicting the country, to say that I'm disappointed is actually an understatement. So, I totally understand that. But if you could zoom out a little bit and focus on some big picture issues, Professor, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and it's something that you briefly mentioned earlier, is the recrudescence of war in Tigray. The fact that Tigray has historically been the epicenter for wars. You know, you could say 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and now. And one wonders why. Is it geography? Is it the sort of politics that Tigrayans have advanced through the times, or other factors that have contributed to this very sorry state of things? Because it's now become part of the mainstream thinking actually in Tigray, where people think, well, we might have peace now, but it's a matter of time before war comes, because that is how it has always been historically. And I wonder what your analysis is of that. Why is it that Tigray has historically been a center of war?
I call my introduction of the book, The Cradle, the Wall, and the Bridge. The guy is situated between the greater world, the Red Sea, the Nile, and the rest of Ethiopia. In Aksumite period, it benefited from the Red Sea, and then isolated as the center of gravity of Ethiopia moved to the south, and it changed time and again. Tigray is very unique in the Ethiopian complex, and it was recognized by the emperors of Ethiopia. They never really controlled Tigray. Theodorus was happy with taking hostages from the aristocratic families. Menelik, after the Adwa victory, he left Ras Makonnen in Mekelle as governor. Ras Makonnen stayed there a few months and returned to Addis. And then Menelik understood, and Haile Selassie understood, that you can't control Tigray. It's too independent and too proud and too strong. Menelik and Haile Selassie allowed the family of Johannes to continue until 1974. Mengistu thought that he could subjugate Tigray, but he got the TPLF on his end. So I think, judging from history, that Tigray would continue to exist as part of the greater Ethiopia. Oh, who knows? Every time I try to be a prophet, I failed. It's difficult enough to prophesize about the past. What will happen? Should the Tigrayans unite after the Tigrayan speakers unite after Isaiah's gone? Should the Tigray become an independent state on its own? Should it be a part of newly integrated Ethiopia? I don't know. I really don't know. But the history is something you cannot avoid. You have to learn. Not that it gives you any key to what will happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. But a better understanding what's going on.
Well, the future of Tigray is one of the hotly debated issues today in Tigray, especially again in the light of the suffering and the devastation that has been unleashed against Tigray for the past 3 years by the Ethiopian regime, by the Eritrean regime. There seems to be a new awakening in the people in Tigray, and there is a newfound political discussion about the future of Tigray in whether it should remain in Ethiopia or whether it should chart a completely different course. And one of the course that people suggest, and I'm talking about people in serious political parties in Tigray, say is that the way for Tigray is to reunite with Eritrea and to become an independent country. And when they make that point, they draw inspiration from the history of the Jewish people. The Jewish people had historically been dispersed. They had gone through trials and tribulations that are even difficult to describe. And they say that the Tigrayans find themselves in a similar situation, divided, half of them in Eritrea and half of them in Tigray, roughly speaking. And the way for these people is to reunite. Is this something? Is this view something that, again, as an historian, you think could materialize in the future? Or maybe, in other words, is there a lesson that the Tigrayans could draw from the Israelis in that sense?
I know that the Eritreans also thought that they are the Zionists of the Horn of Africa, that they are a small nation and they can cope with all the challenges around it. It's good to learn the history of others and become wiser. But you can never tell where it is going. I give you the last example, allow me. In the 70s, I was on sabbatical in the States, and all the progressive elements were admiring Eritrea. That there is a revolution there, that they democratize, that they liberate women, that they open society. And Ethiopia, under Haile Selassie, then under Mengistu, were closing on its society. And Eritrea was the model of liberation fronts that are democratical institutes in themselves, and that's the future of Ethiopia also, that they learn from Eritrea how to get organized politically. And indeed, the TPLF was born on the model of the EPL. And then things change. Eritrea became a dictatorship, the great exporters of refugees in the world. And Ethiopia opened up until recently. I can give you hundreds of stories of how I thought I know what will happen, and then I was proven right only 50%. You can never tell. Once it is history, I will explain it. But where it is going now, I'll give you the last example. In 1990 something, I was summoned to the president of Tel Aviv University, and he said, Asmara University want to sign a sort of a treaty with Tel Aviv University. What is the future of Asmara University? Write me a paper. And I wrote 4 pages on what is the future of Eritrea, of Asmara University. And I think the punchline was that if only 10% of the Eritreans in the diaspora would return to Asmara University, it will be the best university in the region. Well, you know what happened. So I really don't know, not that I'm playing modest. I really don't know what will happen. It can come from everywhere. So let's remain hopeful.
Well, but one of the things that happens in Tigray historically is after the conclusion of a war, people say that we should learn the lessons and we should make sure that war doesn't come to us in the future. But despite that determination to learn from history, it doesn't look like that we, the Tigrayans, have learned proper lessons from history, at least lessons that give us the tools and the ways to protect ourselves from enemies and from war. I mean, you will be aware that 1 million people are believed to have perished in the last war, and there is now a desperate need in Tigray to learn the right lessons and to take steps to protect Tigray from future devastation. But it doesn't look like, from where I'm sitting again, it doesn't look like that we have found the right lessons. It doesn't. I mean, in the book, you say that Tigrayans have always been undermined by their own arrogance and by the internal factions and internal divisions. So there are these perennial problems. So definitely, these are some of the lessons that Tigrayans could do well to learn. But what do you think is the wider lesson that Tigrayans should really, really take the time to learn from history?
To work hard, to compromise with reality, and find a Tigrayan place under the all Ethiopian sun. To be overambitious is always self-defeating. To build Tigray itself. And continue quarreling with each other. I don't believe in better energies in society other than constructive arguments. I really, that's what I do all my life. Whenever I try to prophesize, I was off. I'll give you the last story, please.
Well, towards the end of the book, you say that you attempted to write a requiem for Tigray because Tigray then was occupied by Eritrean and Ethiopian forces. But then when you were about to write that, all of a sudden the Tigray Defense Forces routed out the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces from Tigray. And that was the reason you didn't write. If you were writing the book today, what would you write, Professor?
I would have stopped in the same point. I thought, as an observer, that TPLF is going to enter Addis Ababa like in 1991. You can never tell. An historian should know his limits. And his contribution by delving into the past and reconstructing what happened, exercising integrity. I give you the last example, please, Guy. In 1991, early May, Israel was planning to rescue the Ethiopian Jews from Addis Ababa, what later became Solomon Operation. I was talking on television and so on. I was never privy to the operation. But then I was summoned by the head of the Mossad, who told me, I listened to your talk on television, and it seems to me that you are the only one who understands Ethiopia here. Will Mengistu lead the Battle of Stalingrad, as he says, against the TPLF? I knew what he's meaning. Because Israel was going to send, at the end, it sent the all passenger planes into Bole Airport in the middle of Addis. Mengistu is having 250,000 soldiers, and the TPLF and the EPRDF around 250,000 soldiers. If there would be a battle on Stalingrad, like Mengistu swears, everyone there in the middle will be slaughtered. And I said, what do you want from me? I'm just an historian. How can I take a risk of saying a thing like that? He said, okay, but what do you think? You are the one who really understands. And I remember what I said. Mengistu, when he drinks coffee in the morning, in his office, I happened to be there once, in his office, there is a big illustration of Emperor Theodorus committing suicide, not falling to the British. So that's the ethos. Then he never missed an opportunity to denounce Haile Selassie for not falling on his sword facing Mussolini, but going away. So he told me, so what you think is that he will fight? Try to say that's history, I don't know, and I was excused. But what implied from what I'm saying is that there will be a fight on Addis Ababa. Now this man has to decide to send the fingers into the boiling battle there or avoid. Fortunately, I was wrong. Because I was implying that there will be a big battle there.
Yeah, well, I mean, they say that predicting the future is a fool's errand, so I understand that. One or two questions more, Professor, if you don't mind. I know that we've taken more time than you've bargained for, so I'm sorry for that. But I think two very crucial pointers, and that would be that. The first one would be something that you actually write at great length in the book about the conflicting sense of identity and conflicting sense of loyalty that Tigrayans have historically had with respect to Ethiopia. And this is a problem that manifests itself in different forms depending on the situation, on the circumstances. In the case of the TPLF, for instance, it was whether to advance to Addis Ababa when they had liberated Tigray or not. There was a fierce debate that was a cause of a serious fraction within the party. And in its current iteration, it looks like it is manifesting itself in the form of a divide within the transitional government now in Tigray. There are some people in the transitional government who say that they should get closer to the federal government, and there are those who say that they shouldn't trust the federal government and that they should actually distance themselves from the federal government. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of people believe the current transitional government in Tigray doesn't really work as a unit, because there's this fundamental divide in terms of belief and sense of identity. What do you say about that? About the conflicting sense of identity that Tigrayans always had? Because on the face of it, it seems like it's been an obstacle for Tigrayans. Is it something that they should reconcile at some point, or is living with the conflicting sense of identity just part and parcel of life?
Identity conflicts and identity crisis is the story of mankind all over. The Israelis between Jewish inheritance and modern Zionism and so on, and the Arabs between the Islam and Arabism and the Egyptianism or what have you. It's everywhere in the world. It's an energy, not necessarily a negative one.
But if I could add one more caveat, sorry, I interjected, Professor. I think that one of the reasons why people believe is a handicap is because foreign powers have historically exploited that to create a sense of anarchy and a sense of standstill in Tigray. And that is what is happening today. Many people would counter.
What foreign countries? What foreign sectors?
So, for instance, the Italians, you say that the Italians follow two political philosophies, like Politicum Ethiopia and Politicum Tigray. And that was a major source of a divide in Tigray. And the Amharas have always also tried to exploit that by creating a sense of, by feeding into that sense of conflicting identity in Tigray. And the current government in Ethiopia is also trying to capitalize on that by creating two parallel political forces in Tigray. One who is more affiliated towards the federal government, and another who is more affiliated towards a more autonomous and a more independent Tigray. So there is that factor that foreign governments or enemies of Tigray have tried to exploit.
It's not about that much about foreign interference. Those foreigners you mentioned, they are also having their own identity problems all along. It's about how to maximize the opportunities that you have by cooperating, compromising, building, instead of antagonizing each other and spend the life with fighting each other. That's easy to me to preach. even though you can speak about Israeli history and also as an ongoing conflict of identities. It's a given. What advice to give? I'm not sure, but things are changing all the time. One last observation. Abiy Ahmed is the son of Ahmed from Ahmad Ali from Jimma. The idea, he is himself a Christian, his mother from Gondar and all that. But the very idea, this son of Ahmad Ali from Jimma would be Prime Minister of Ethiopia. If you look at that against history, what a change. Jimma, by the way, was autonomous, the only region that Menelik gave it autonomy, and it was preserved by Haile Selassie until 1934, when Mussolini threatened to impose Islam on Ethiopia, and then Haile Selassie abolished the autonomy of Islamic Jimma, and that arose anger all over the Islamic world. So it's a symbol, the Islam of Jimma. And now the son of, things do change all the time. After it happens, an historian can be wise and say this and this were conducive to that. But where it's, who could say a few years ago that I think an eventuality like this can happen? So I hope I am not disappointing you too much. I really don't know about the future.
No, I think I understand. I understand, Professor. Just one final point, and I'm just going to ask you about the main theme of the book, the mysterious magnetism. What is it?
What it used to be, I can say. Not that I know or understand everything. But I can say there was the tradition, there was the institution of the emperorship, and the hierarchy of the church, and for people in the periphery or the elite in the various peripheries, it was worthwhile to belong to the all Ethiopian game. There was something to earn from that and become a Gojami or a Sidamar, whatever you, and as elite, to be part of the all Ethiopian game, to have a house in Addis Ababa and gain from the general economy and so on. And Ethiopia is a meaningful entity for the whole world as Ethiopia, for the Islamic world, the Jewish world, and the Christian world. So to separate from Ethiopia, for me, it's a bad prescription to build the future. So that was the magnetism. Does it still exist? I wonder. I really wonder. But I still believe that there is a great significance to being an Ethiopian, to be Tigrayan, Afar, whatever you, but to be an Ethiopian, I was proud to learn history of Ethiopia. I am fascinating. I was in the orbit of that magnetism myself. So if you ask my advice, remain in the orbit of Ethiopianness. Tigray, I have to go.
Well, I totally understand. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful conversation, and thank you for writing it's a wonderful book. It's a fascinating book. So I strongly recommend everybody to read. Those of you who have the means to buy the book, of course. It's titled Greater Tigray and the Mysterious Magnetism of Ethiopia. You could find it on Amazon and I presume other booksellers as well. So thank you for staying with us, and thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure. Take good
Thank
care.
you. Bye-bye.